You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your fresh off the boat host, Abraham.
Oh, nice. And I am your lives in a state that doesn't have to worry about border crises host, Shane. That's very long. It just got higher as I went. I didn't know where to go with that.
I really liked it. Yeah, it's like it started in falsetto, and the only place I had to go was up.
Yep. That's me.
And we're a psychology podcast. We talk about the psychology things, and one of the things that we've been talking about is immigration. And this is a part 2. So if you missed part 1, I encourage you to go back and listen to that. As always, we do try and ensure that these episodes will more or less stand on their own to an extent, but we set a lot of background and helpful context in the first part of this discussion that I think would be useful for moving forward into the second part. If you like what you hear today, if you like the previous episode, you can support us. There's various ways you can do that, which is going to our store and picking up some merch. You can like and subscribe and share with a friend. You can join us over on Patreon. You can crochet our name into a pillow that you then put out where everyone can see whenever they enter your house. But I'll talk more about ways that you can support us at the end of this discussion. And before we get into our discussion, we like to acknowledge the various holidays and traditions around the world that are relevant to the day, the publication date of each episode. And so, Shane, what are some things we're celebrating today?
So today on January 11th, we are celebrating National Take the Stairs Day.
It's a good one.
Yeah, I like that.
Also, International Party at Work Day. So,
yeah,
absolutely. Plan ahead. I guess you can't plan ahead because it's already the day of. So hopefully you planned ahead.
I mean, every day can be a party if you try hard enough, I guess.
That's fair.
It's also National Hot Toddy Day, which is perfect because it's winter and very cold.
Which that's probably why they chose this day.
Yeah, just that specific day. That's the coldest day, apparently.
It is Heritage Treasures Day, although I don't know. I didn't look into this one too much. I'm hoping this has to do in some way with repatriation of appropriated cultural things.
Agreed. Well, I hope that's what it is. It's also National Learn Your Name in Morse Code Day. So beep, 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 beep.
That's spelled.
I hope I didn't say anything offensive. Please don't code that out. I have no idea what I said.
It's probably a mishmash of just various consonants and vowels.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, that's how you spell Shane phonetically.
A
couple other fun ones. It is for the month. We have National Clean Up Your Computer Month. So clear your downloads folder, everybody. Empty your trash or recycle bins, whatever device you're on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also National Oatmeal Month.
Yum.
Totally a big fan of that.
It is Celebration of Life Month, which oftentimes I think people talk about celebrations of life. They're often rebranding the wake, if you will.
Yeah.
Or the memorial service. And this actually is described as simply celebrating the lives that we live and the things that we get to experience on a daily basis by virtue of the fact that we are here. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, that's very wholesome. It's also International Brain Teaser Month, which I love these. I remember having a book when I was a kid that was like pictures, like drawn pictures, and you had to kind of guess what the phrase was.
Oh, okay.
You know, it'd have like a line, and then it would say like, you know, I don't know, it's something like underline or like Batman, like it was like man made of bats and stuff like that. And you're like, okay, I got this. Like, so I always like stuff like this.
Basically someone who both loved Pictionary and dad jokes and created a book about it.
That's my origin story.
The final holiday we'll recognize before moving on, there are more for January, but the final one we'll recognize is National Soup Month. So if that's your thing,
it's my thing.
You could be eating oatmeal and soup, I guess, while celebrating your life, doing a brain teaser after having just cleaned up your computer and used your new, freshly nice working computer to learn your name in Morse code. Maybe use your computer also to send back some artifacts that you appropriated that aren't yours. And with your soup oatmeal mix, you're also drinking a hot toddy. All of this taking place on the stairs and at a party at work. And that is full, intense celebration.
Yeah, that's a big day. I have a question for you.
Shoot.
If the oatmeal that you make is too watery, at what point in time does it become a soup?
Let's say at a 2-to-1 ratio.
Okay. All right. I think that's a perfect answer.
Okay. I made it up, and it's my podcast, so I can do that thing.
Yeah, you've codified it, I think, so we're good.
All right. So last time we talked a lot about the background of immigration. We really got into some considerations around immigration and some of what we're going to try and do with respect to always thinking about not only what is happening when someone immigrates, but what their experience is of the immigration process, and then some other considerations around people's attitudes toward immigration and that sort of thing. And then we really dug into why people immigrate. And we mentioned push and pull factors and what those are, basically motivation to go somewhere or to leave somewhere. And oftentimes you have both, but those are some variables that will influence where people end up. So today, what we're going to be talking more about is what happens to the place that people leave, what happens to the place that people arrive to, and then some like myth busting and some stats mostly.
Well, and I think this is the part that people will often hang their hat on for arguments, like when people want to kind of pretend that they dislike immigration when they're really saying that they just don't like people of a different color most of the time.
Yeah.
What they try to do is they try to make these arguments, and we'll show kind of how a lot of the arguments they make are not even statistically correct, let alone even factual on any level.
Yes. So it tends to be the case that more people listen to a part one than a part two in podcast episodes. But I think this is the meatier of the two. I like what we did in the first one. Very proud of it. I thought it was a good discussion. This one has a lot of heft, if you will.
Yes.
It's a girthy one.
It's a girthy episode, so get ready.
And somehow we are pretty deep into it and we haven't even started talking about it. So let us begin.
Yes.
By talking about what happens to the country when people immigrate away from the country.
Yes. So when people leave the source country or the place that they're from, there's a lot of things that kind of happen, and it really depends on the reason why people leave. So if a country has high unemployment or a poor economy, then emigrating citizens tend to help alleviate the burden of unemployment and increase wages of the remaining citizens. So there's less people to have to worry about allocating resources to. So further, those then employed citizens may actually send money back home, which you hear a lot of stories about people going to another country, making money and sending it home to maybe alleviate some of that economic stress.
Yes. But there are other things that happen when someone leaves a country. Some considerations include that tends to, when they leave, they're going to be leaving people behind. They're leaving family, they're leaving friends, they're leaving coworkers, whatever is happening, neighbors. And what that does tend to do also then is destabilize the family or the social network that that person was a part of, and also disrupts the stability of the home and sort of social groups of which people are a part. And so they might be leaving because they're fleeing something, or even if they're leaving for better opportunity, those are also effects of things that can happen when someone moves away.
Right. And also, depending on the source country, you might see populations dwindle and you might see governments lose power as a result. So what we mean by that is, like, we can use an example of like maybe like a really strict dictatorship that is controlling the large population of people that's there. As more people end up leaving and fleeing from that country, the less people that they have to control, the less power they have over a group of people, or the less power they have over their nation. And that government ends up losing a lot of power as a result, because people forget that governments are powered by the people.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. So you just have like a small handful, not a small handful, but as a country shrinks, so too does that government's ability to do anything. The people who are producing for their GDP, the people who are innovating growth, the people who are building the economy and building infrastructure, like there's fewer of them. There's not that much for the government to do. There's not that much for them to, like, they don't have very much power, I guess.
Right. Exactly.
An important consideration, which leads to then a discussion about what happens to the receiving country of people who are immigrating.
Yes. And this is, I would make an argument, the primary talking point that people make, or the arguments that they'll make about why immigration is bad, which is ridiculous. So immigrants actually, when they go to a receiving country, they can actually help boost the economic growth and productivity of receiving places. Even low productivity from immigrants results in economic growth in the receiving economy. So you'll see that people entering a receiving country, wherever they end up, they typically help boost the economy in those spaces.
Yeah, and for context, I checked so many sources for this, and I just kept finding the same numbers over and over again, or the same information over and over again. I tried checking sources from people with different backgrounds, where you had sort of more conservative, not so conservative, that sort of thing. more liberal and that sort of thing, and found, again, very consistent information. And one of the things we talked a lot about in the last discussion that we need to always couch it in here is a lot of times people say, we don't disagree with that, but we're only wanting legal immigration. And one of the points that we made last episode is that the people who say, like, we're all for legal immigration, but their big talking point is illegal immigration, and why they want to try and slow down immigration is they are often shrinking what legal means. They're trying to make that the narrowest, most difficult possible path that it can be. So legal immigration becomes like a unicorn. You almost can't find it, right? Because it becomes nearly impossible for anybody to do it unless they're from white Anglo countries. To the United States specifically. Other countries, like they'll have other, they're still trying to restrict immigration a lot of the time. But what happens is when you have a path to legal immigration, then you have these big boosts in the boosts in the economy. There is the consideration. So on the flip side of that, part of the reason that happens is people who immigrate tend to take on jobs that is whatever is available, right? Unless they moved for a specific job, which can happen. Absolutely. People can hire from outside the country, wherever they're immigrate from and to, and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the time, people will just take kind of whatever job is available. A lot of time that means a job that's not particularly high wage. And so what that does mean is that immigration can temporarily hurt the economic success of local populations in small segments of the market. That is a thing that can happen. However, and this is a very big however, because again, I checked so many sources for this.
Yeah.
This can be largely mitigated if the government policies support immigrants into their receiving communities. So I'm just going to say that again, make sure that I'm really clear, is that if a path to immigration is made available, then the impact that immigration has on local economies tends to be reduced. It already wasn't going to be large in the first place, but it tends to be minimized even further if you have good infrastructure and good policies and good setup for facilitating the immigration.
Basically, what you're saying is that the negative impacts are not that great to begin with, like in terms of like they're not large to begin with. But if there's a path, then they're even less, right? We can control that.
Correct.
Now, policies that make it more difficult for immigrants tend to force them into greater poverty, which makes it more difficult for them to contribute meaningfully to the economy in which they live. And that's specifically from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some specific things, that, like kind of how this looks when the policies either work in favor of immigrants coming or against immigrants coming over.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think try and highlight the best that we can the irony of the system that people make it difficult for immigration and then complain about the effect of immigration on the economy. I'm like, you created that problem. Like, this is your mistake. Anyway, as we were saying, you segued beautifully into the sort of finer points of this. One of them is that when policies help people immigrate successfully, they're more likely to be integrated immediately into the economic system, which means in part that they're more likely to end up in places where there are jobs for which they're not necessarily displacing people because they're going into a fair wage market, as one. And two, that means they're also immediately going into a system in which they're contributing to taxes and other like financial infrastructure that's built into the system. Right.
Even if they aren't on a payroll, but are paid for odd jobs and under the table deals, they still have to buy food, which you have to pay taxes on food. You have to buy meals, which you pay taxes, clothes, you pay taxes, gas and transportation, you pay taxes, rent, utilities, other goods and services. That means they're paying into the economy, whether they're on a payroll or not. And here's what I'm going to say about this real quick, because everybody kind of goes, well, they're working under the table. You have too. So I don't even want to hear it. I've worked odd jobs. I've worked under the table. I've done that like early in my youth. I don't do that now, but like I used to do that. And like if you've ever gone and done something and somebody handed you cash and you didn't report that, like that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about here.
And there are going to be thousands or tens of thousands of native born people in a country The United States is definitely one of them. Like, I know people for whom this is true, but this will also be true in other countries where their whole life they just take odd jobs and under the table deals.
Yeah.
Like, they don't ever get super wealthy, but like that was their choice. They're like, I'm going to go build this person's shed and make a couple $1,000, which I'll use to pay rent. Or I'm going to go, clean all the trash out of this person's crazy junkyard of a backyard. And they're going to pay me, $700. That's going to buy me groceries this week and whatnot. Yeah, like this is irrelevant of like whether or not you were born in the place where you end up doing that sort of work. People are going to do that sort of work.
Right. Exactly. It's mind blowing that that's like an argument. It's like you have probably done that thing.
Yeah. Okay, so then we've already said basically that you are still paying into the economy, you're still contributing, you're still helping things grow. It works a little better if they've been integrated into the system, but they're still going to have to participate in it one way or another. The other thing here, and again, this is from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, is that this idea that migrant workers help smooth out bumps and wrinkles in the economy. And this is because, as we mentioned, they often fill in the gaps during times of worker shortages. So there are times when businesses, they're not replacing their workers with illegal or undocumented workers. They're trying to fill in like a workforce where they don't have people even applying.
Right.
And rather than suffer the consequences of not being able to fulfill on the demand of your company, you hire people who are there to fit that demand. And so it can, as I said, it smooths out those bumps and wrinkles and those sorts of time in those situations. And sort of related to this is that when they are integrated into the system, what that can mean, that can be very helpful for the native people where they're moving in to do the work, is they start paying into the Social Security system, and then the people who are there get to retire, and they're benefiting from a system where people are paying into their retirement who are, again, filling in the gap of them having left that system, if that makes sense. So it creates an influx of the ability for people to leave a system and continue to benefit from it than the people who are native to that system. So basically, let me try and put that, I'm using sort of vague terms, where most of our listeners are in the United States. This statement that I'm giving is true of pretty much all economies, but we'll just use the United States as an example of, let's say some people immigrate to Florida for some reason, and there are a bunch of people there who are trying to retire, and they do, and they weren't going to have very much in terms of their retirement, but all of these people who immigrated to Florida are filling in the jobs that the people who are retiring are no longer fulfilling, and then the people are still then paying into that system that pays those retiring people their retirement savings account sort of stuff. That what happens then is that everybody wins. Like those people get to make money. Mm-hmm. The people who are immigrating make money. The people who are retiring get to keep money and like receive an income. But the business that the person retired from has people working there.
Right. It's funny how that works, right? I mean, it sounds like it's win-win for everybody when it's done well.
Yep. Well, we've been talking a lot, and I think you'd probably like to know what happens to the wages of the people in the jobs where immigrants tend to work. But first, we need to sell you some ads that were created by immigrant workers. We are back. Let's talk about what happens to the wages of jobs where immigrants come into those same wage marketplaces, if you will.
So immigration can actually drive down wages of competing workers in low-level jobs. And some experts say it's so low and contained that it's essentially zero impact. And so this also drives down the cost of goods and services in those industries, making products and services more affordable for a larger proportion of the country. So they drive up the wages of jobs in complementary professions like translators, supervisors, pharmaceutical reps, immigration lawyers, and it's not equally beneficial for everyone, but for most people. It's an overall net gain when we see kind of like the impact on wages of immigration for certain professions.
Yeah, so of the sources that I looked at, some of them said, like, yes, they can bring down the wages of competing workers in low-level jobs. All of them said it's largely contained to very small subsections of the job economic market. And some of them also said the effect is so small, it almost doesn't exist. Like you can find it in some places, but it's negligible most of the time.
Right.
That doesn't help the person who just lost their job and they were replaced by someone who is taking a lower wage. I do get that. But I also think if we look at this broad scale, like that just does not affect a very large part of the job market. And it's not ideal that someone will lose their job. I do sympathize with that situation, and I can understand why that would be frustrating. But I think, again, just when we look at the overall effect of this, is like an economy is a very complicated thing. It is a lot of moving parts. And so I think when we look at it from a large economic perspective, there's a net gain in that situation purely from an economic perspective. That is not to downplay the effect of the person who just lost their job. And I understand, like, that sucks. And I totally get that. And I think that we want to generally try and minimize that happening as much as possible. But I think zeroing in on that one very small incident as like we need to stop immigration because there's the tiniest fraction of the economy that will change a little bit in this direction that is unwanted by some people does not seem like a great reason when there's a net gain across the board.
Right. Absolutely. 100%.
I will say that, like, this is coming from the perspective of someone who's been privileged enough to not be threatened, like have their work threatened by someone who's willing to come in and do their job for less. So I get that I don't have, like, I'm not bringing a level of impact that, like, this has affected me personally. And that is like a position that means that I'm not being as sympathetic to that as someone who is in that position might be. And like I said, I'm trying to look at this from like an economic sort of big picture perspective and not a sort of personal individual level perspective.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, we're looking at data that's been produced, that kind of like consistent data that's been produced about this.
Yeah.
Now, immigration also puts a demand on local governments to have a budget for state services that include stuff like public education. Now, in this investment, if it's made, those investments can result in those immigrants who are here, who are accessing these services, they can be much more productive members of society that eventually accelerate economic growth. So, if you spend a little bit of money up front, you're going to get way more payback at the end. When folks are going through education systems, when they're able to contribute different innovations, different services, different goods into their local communities, it's all going to pay back tenfold.
It's interesting because some of the data I found said that the first generation immigrants, they tend to not have as large of an economic impact in terms of growth of the GDP. And as we said, like, what happens is that their children then have to go into the public education system, which means the government, the state government, the local government is paying into the education system for those people to be in there, for those kids. The next generation of kids tend to actually be more productive in economic growth and growth of the GDP than the native population. Again, purely from a numbers perspective, the investment in the education for those immigrants actually has them be much more productive down the road. So even though it is a huge cost up front, there's a return on investment pretty much immediately once they're into the labor market.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's little things like that nobody is looking at.
Now, I had this really interesting quote, and the source surprised me greatly. And I'm actually going to quote this person a couple of times. Her name is, I'm reading this as Pia Orenius, I'm thinking. And I found this on the George W. Bush Institute website. This was, I think, a blog or some kind of contribution written in 2016. And she said, quote, "When immigrants enter the labor force, they increase the productive capacity of the economy and raise the GDP. Their incomes rise, but so do those of the natives." End quote. Again, I was really surprised to find all of this information at that particular source.
Yeah.
But straight up saying that immigrants coming into an economic system are a gain for that system.
And so far, what we're seeing is in all the sources that we've looked at and all of the studies that have been done, we're finding that there's actually more of a positive impact than a negative impact.
Yes, pretty much across the board.
Consistently in multiple areas. So we're gonna keep talking about that. In 2017, the 2017 National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, they found that immigration is an economic net positive. And those negative impacts of immigration on wages is minimal and largely contained in those small segments of the labor market, like Abraham mentioned before. So basically what it's saying is in all of these areas, science, engineering, medicine, everything is good. It's a good thing overall. It's impacting the economy in a good way. And those wage issues are very, very minimum, like you said, to almost no effect.
So 20 years of data showed that the first generation immigrants were generally less of a contribution to the economy than native citizens. They still contributed. It wasn't that they were not a contribution or that they resulted in decline. It just wasn't as much as natives. Also, this evens out with the fact, if you do consider what their economic contributions are and that they're they're a little bit smaller than native citizens, it actually kind of evens out for them because native citizens are much more expensive for the government. Like they're receiving that retirement and all these other benefits and things from the government, like any other government services that they might be receiving. And so also the first generation of immigrants tend to be a greater contribution to the economy than those native born citizens and the children of native born citizens. So as I was saying earlier, that investment really pays off.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in 2019, a study found that policies that reduced immigration did not actually lead to higher wages for native born citizens. It hindered people getting paid more.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because that's sort of the argument is well, if we stymie this, then we'll have better jobs, better employment, and better pay for the people who are here. Like, well, not according to the data that we have.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the data is showing that actually we need, immigration is good to get you better paying jobs.
So I found some kind of interesting information, and one of them had to do with, if you look purely correlationally, the rates of immigration slowed down during the recession in the United States, and we also had much less economic growth. And then immigration increased when we were coming out of the recession. So just as a thing to consider.
Yeah.
Here's another quote that I found that, again, it had so much information. I just wanted to quote it directly. This is from a website called fws.us. And I looked around. It was not clear on what that stood for exactly, but that was the website. And I felt like it was less important than the quote anyway. So here's the quote. Quote, immigrants added $2 trillion to the U.S. GDP in 2016 and $458.7 billion to state, local, and federal taxes in 2018. In 2018, after immigrants spent billions of dollars on state and local and federal taxes, they were left with $1.2 trillion in spending power, which they used to purchase goods and services, stimulating local business activity. End quote. So again, just saying what's really important to consider here is that when they come into economy, and it doesn't even matter if they're sending money back home. They can't send all their money back home because they have to pay to live. They're paying rent and gas and road tolls and utilities, and they're buying groceries. They're paying into the economy constantly. And if they were facilitated into the economy through policies that got them integrated into the system faster, then they're also paying taxes into the local governments. So again, the net gain is very clearly there.
Yeah, and on top of that, if they are sending money out of the country to families, do you think that those families are not eventually going to end up in the United States as immigrants that can be contributing members of the society? Or do you not think that global economies are not so interlinked that they're not spending some money somewhere on some service that's going to come from some local economy? I mean, it's all related. I mean, it's bizarre to me that nobody sees that kind of web of the economy and how everything is linked together.
And also, I think ultimately, if somebody earns some amount of money, what they do with it, I would think this is the thing that kind of confuses me. I would think the conservative, libertarian, ultra liberty, freedom people would be like, your money is your money. You do with it what you want. You want to set it on fire? You should be able to do that. You want to stick it bury it in a vault underground so that your 4 generations later can find it and have this old money that's worth something, I guess. I don't know. I don't know if that's a thing, but you can do that because it's your money. I think that would be the position. And so the fact that someone wants to spend their money or send it elsewhere or give it to somebody, I feel like it's confusing to me that somebody who champions liberty with your property would find problems with that as a thing.
Right.
None of it really clicks in my mind. And the way, the data, that argument doesn't make sense. Logically, the data doesn't make sense. Based on values, the argument doesn't make sense. So I think I said data one of those times. I meant to say argument. But yeah. Anyway, we also have some important myths to bust about U.S. immigrants and some ads to bust the smooth flow of this discussion. Okay, we're back. Let's talk about some myths about specifically U.S. immigrants. These are very U.S.-centric topics, although I do think some of them you'll find some generalization to other countries with immigration as well.
Yes, so we're going to start with COVID because that's a thing that was a really big argument that people were making for a long time.
Probably still will,
Yeah, people like to argue about this a lot. one of the myths is that immigrants are carrying COVID and other diseases into the U.S. But here's kind of the thing about this. First, there are a lot of states that championed kind of the, banning travel into the air or whatever. There's a lot of that discussion, right? But states that championed this specific argument that immigrants are carrying COVID are also the states that banned or otherwise condemned efforts to control the spread of COVID. So Florida and Texas and other conservative places condemned the use of vaccines, masks, lockdowns, and social distancing, and saw the highest number of cases and deaths. And that those data are mostly readily available, not Florida, because they decided to hide those data as well.
Sure.
But those places also blame those things on immigrants. One, initially during lockdown, immigration functionally ground to a near halt, yet infections rose. So myth busted, one. Two, there was a surge in immigration that correlated in time with the surge in COVID cases. However, tracking COVID cases showed that variants spreading were the U.S. variants. They weren't from other places. Actually, it was the U.S. citizens getting the immigrants sick and not the other way around. So we were actually contributing to those increases, not immigrants coming here.
And again,
Wild.
this is in places where they were engaged in active efforts to not prevent the spread of COVID.
Yes.
They're like, here are the things that we know work. Don't do any of those. Matter of fact, we're going to put in laws that make it increasingly difficult to take basic precautionary measures as a universal sort of approach to stopping the spread of a deadly disease. And then they're like, they have the surge in cases and they're like, well, it was the immigrants. I'm like, just because you happen to be on the south end of things doesn't mean that it was their fault. Like this was, if you look anywhere where they decided to issue basic precautionary measures of like health and safety, they were going to have a rise in cases.
Right.
And as we said, you're getting them sick.
Right. And Florida's so weird. Like Florida doesn't even share a border with another nation. Like, but it's still like a thing that people get really upset with here. It's really bonkers to me. Like,
yeah,
I don't understand it myself.
Now, okay. We always got to talk about the legal, illegal thing, right? Because largely I think those arguments are about illegal immigrants. I think all of the data and arguments that we've made still hold. Important thing here, when people come into the country illegally, they do not go through the same medical screening that legal immigrants receive. That's one of the things that they often point to, is the fact that they're bringing in all these diseases and that sort of thing. The problem is, like, that's partially because it's become so difficult to immigrate into the United States and many other countries. And so anybody who immigrates here through any process where there is a route to legal immigration is going to get medical screening, because immigrants can bring diseases with them. This is true. They certainly can. So if we can screen for those when they're coming through, then we can be prepared to prevent that from happening or to provide treatment so that it doesn't spread, or handle it however they're going to handle it. But like having a path to legal immigration means that their screening happens. Not having a path to legal immigration means that screening does not happen. And just as an important side note, because there's lots of illegal immigration that happens in lots of different ways into the United States, people will talk about like they're bringing all these diseases back. There's no evidence of any outbreaks of any disease that has been credibly attributed to immigration, legal or illegal. There have been outbreaks of disease largely among communities of unvaccinated people.
Yes.
And so where there are places with large swaths of the population who, again, are turning their noses up at basic life-saving vaccines, we do see outbreaks of disease. But again, not from immigration, because those things spread because people will not take basic precautionary, effective, and safe measures.
There are literally too many variables to contribute or attribute any of the outbreaks to immigration. There's no evidence to support it. Arguably, there's plenty of historical evidence, right? I mean, and it's mostly white people bringing diseases to indigenous peoples. Like there's evidence there. Like, hey, smallpox, you're welcome. Here's a welcome gift of our immigration to the United States. Great. But like currently, when we look at these data and we look at these kind of the outbreaks that have happened, they've happened in places where there were no mask mandates, where nothing was shut down, where, like literally the governor of Florida was telling people to take their masks off during times when it was like we were at peak COVID. So, God, it's so frustrating. I want to be clear. I don't get frustrated about this from like a political standpoint. I get frustrated about this from like a science standpoint.
Right.
There are so many like bits of data out there that point to the opposite of what you're hearing from like certain talking points. Like, It just blows my mind. And that's where I get frustrated. So I apologize if that's coming out right now, but I live in a state where this is just a thing that's been going on for many years, and it's really frustrating to see it.
For sure.
So another myth that comes up a lot is that immigrants bring crime and violence. Well, not entirely true. Crime and violence exists in the United States. As a matter of fact, if you want to talk about gun violence and specific gun deaths, most of them that include murder are usually done by people in the United States who are citizens who legally obtained a gun. So when we talk about crime and violence, it's coming from within the United States. It's not coming from outside most of the time.
Yeah, usually people just want to get into a country and just live and work and do that sort of thing. There's not a lot of motivation to go into a country and then commit crimes.
That's not to say it doesn't happen. Now, we're not saying 100% of the time, but the thing is it's not as much of a problem as people make it out to be.
Yeah, I think they're generally more likely to be the victims of crime and violence and that sort of thing.
100%.
All right, another myth. Immigrants are uneducated. A lot of immigrants actually come to this country both because they're trying to get an education or they're trying to get, some other opportunity or flee a country and that sort of thing. So a lot of people actually arrive here with doctorate degrees, with high levels of education. There are countries for which their high school education is to the United States better than a college degree and sometimes even a graduate level degree.
Yes.
Because their education system is better. So a lot of people come to this country with very, very good education, and they can't find a lot of work in their field for various reasons. And so they end up doing things like running a food cart or a food truck or driving a taxi or working in construction. And it's not because they're not intelligent people who are uneducated, it's because that was the opportunity that was handed to them in the circumstances that brought them to the country. So just a thing.
Absolutely. I've worked with people who got into food service who held master's degrees and doctorates, but because their doctorate didn't transfer over because of whatever reasons, they ended up not being able to find a job in their field.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. There's another myth. Immigrants are a drain on the economy. And we've kind of already talked about the economic contributions and stuff like that. But a lot of the arguments I hear is they're getting free public education and they're getting free medical and all the stuff. You hear all that. Well, the truth is, welfare. I hear that all the time. Welfare is a big thing that kind of comes up a lot. The truth is that the majority of people who are on welfare are white families that live in the United States. That is the majority of people who are receiving welfare services, specifically stuff like unemployment and food stamps and those types of things that are social programs, which are good programs. We need them.
Right.
But the majority of people that are receiving them are typically white families, not immigrants. Because if you're undocumented, how do you even access that information? How do you even access that service?
True.
If you're illegal.
Right. Yeah. And then path illegal means you usually are able to end up in a position where you can be integrated into the system.
Right.
Another myth, immigrants don't try to learn English. This one's pretty United States centric. I think the nugget of truth to this is that many immigrants will end up in communities of their peers or their family or their friends or of at least people who come from the same country they do. And so they don't have an opportunity to learn English as much. But almost everyone tries to learn English when they come to the United States, if they can. There's not a lot of easy paths to that, and our language is monstrously complicated and very difficult to learn.
Unnecessarily so.
Yes, very unnecessarily so. They try to learn, they want to learn, they'll pick it up, but it can be difficult. And many of them will learn. They'll get perfectly fluent at speaking English. And also, just to be fair, none of you who are arguing with me saying, well, they don't try to learn English. I'm when was the last time you visited a country and tried to learn their language?
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. Also, the United States does not have an official language.
Really?
Yeah. English is not we do not have an official language.
At the federal level. But I think many states have official languages.
Another myth is that all immigrants are escaping war and poverty. That's not entirely true. There are people that are coming here for education. There are people here that are coming for experience. There are people here who are coming for families. There's a whole host of reasons why people come here. And it's not always because they are struggling in another nation. There are multiple examples where this is clearly not true. And while there are, we do have refugee programs and we do have sanctuary or, the idea of a sanctuary city and all that stuff, while those things do exist, that's not the entire reason why immigrants are coming here. So to make that argument is really kind of not nuanced.
Another myth is that immigrants are coming in just to vote. I think I can break this down in three pieces. One, if they're coming here legally, then eventually they will be able to be integrated in the system and be able to vote. Most people seem to be okay with legal immigration, so I don't see why that's a problem or if anyone's even claiming that it is. Two, If they're illegally coming into the country, then there's no way they could possibly get into the system so that they could vote, and they probably wouldn't know how because like it's very, very different depending on where you're at, and like they have to go in and like check your ID, and if they somehow were able to figure out mail-in ballots and follow all the complicated rules, but then they weren't actually in the system, it wouldn't be counted anyway. And I don't know how they would get one, because you get a mail-in ballot sent to you as a registered voter, and you can't be registered if you're not in the system. So that's part two. Part three is, I think where this tends to come from is people believing that immigrants will vote with the left. The only reason that there's maybe some nugget of truth to that is that it tends to be that policies from people on the left tend to support people who are immigrants and support policies that build infrastructure for those types of people and that sort of thing. Otherwise, a lot of immigrants come in from all walks of life. Like you're having people who are coming in who are conservative, who are liberal, who are in the middle, who are on all over the spectrum politically. They're just people, right? And so they're going to come in with whatever political baggage that they've got. So they're not really going to vote one way or another unless you've made them your enemy before they got here.
Right.
If you as a political party have made demons of the people who are immigrating into this country, unlikely they're going to be your ally right out the gate. So the fact that they might see voting in line with left-leaning policies might be a product of the fact that the right were demonizing immigrants who may have voted for them right out the gate.
Right.
So just as a consideration there.
Well, and just another example of how immigrants voting for the left is entirely not true. Living in Florida, in the population in Miami, which, first of all, this is going to tackle a couple things. Everybody should go visit Miami for multiple reasons. One, when people say immigrants try not to learn English, Miami is full of Spanish-speaking members of the community, and there are a lot of Spanish-speaking signs, but it's a mixture. Like you see both. There's a large Spanish-speaking population that lives in Miami, but they live in the communities where most everybody is speaking Spanish. So it's a kind of an interesting thing. The second thing about that is that a lot of times when you speak to a lot of Cuban refugees who are leaving a communist state like Cuba, they tend to vote right. They tend to vote for more conservative policies because they're trying to avoid things like communism.
Right.
Just to kind of debunk all that. Like it's there, like when you look at the actual information that is there, you'll find that none of these myths are true.
Another reason to visit Miami is that it will be gone someday in the not too distant future as the ocean swallows it. So there's
and
that.
also Cafecito. So that's that's another another reason to go there. All right, another myth that we want to talk about is that it's easy to immigrate. We've already kind of established that it's not. It's very much so not, and it's getting harder and harder when people put in policies that make it more difficult and kind of cover the path to immigration.
Another myth is that immigrants don't work as hard to be successful as the native population. There's no evidence for this. Actually, all evidence points to the contrary, that they tend to work very hard. They're often scared of being deported. They're scared of losing their job. They're usually in volatile situations, and they're just trying to get by as best they can. So they're usually working very, very hard. And of course, you in any situation, you might have people who are sort of malingerers and whatnot that happen, but it is not in any way endemic to someone being an immigrant or not.
Absolutely, 100%.
Speaking of not working hard, we're going to earn some money by playing some ads.
Somebody else's ads.
All right, let's wrap this up by talking about some statistics to just cover some important things about, or some maybe interesting information about immigration, some things that I found when looking around for some. And one that I think is interesting is the top 10 immigrant receiving countries. I was kind of curious to see where things lie, and I was very surprised at many of these.
Yeah, so number 10 is Italy, and number 9 is Canada.
Number 8 is Chile, and number 7 is Turkey.
Oh, Turkey. Interesting.
Yeah, that one surprised me that would be in the top 10.
Yeah, that's weird. Number 6 is the United Kingdom, and number 5 is South Korea. Totally understand South Korea.
Yes, I do too. Number 4 is Japan, and then number 3, we're in the top 3 now, is Spain, which also kind of surprised me, but not as much.
Surprised me, but I hear it's beautiful there.
Yeah.
Number 2 is the U.S. See, we're not number 1, so when those people go out and cheer for that, we're number 2 when it comes to immigration stats. And then number 1 is Germany, of all places. That one is really, really surprising.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised, but when I looked around, there were a lot of stories of people who Germany's like the place that people go. They've made a lot of strides, I think, to make it a more welcoming sort of place, given their history.
Yes, for sure.
Okay, so I'm going to throw some percentages at you, so I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
In the labor market, here are the percent of people without a 4-year college degree, and this is specifically immigrants. This is immigrants in the labor market without a 4-year college degree. 36% of them are in farming, fishing, forestry occupations. And again, this is workers without a 4-year college degree. 36% of that labor market is immigrants without a 4-year college degree. And that's a lot. Farming, fishing, and forestry, that's a lot.
Yeah, that's huge. 36 are in building and grounds cleaning and maintenance. So that's another, I mean, you're talking like 72% right now. That's a lot. No, I'm just joking. That's not 72. We're not adding percentages right now. But 36% of the market of building and grounds cleaning is made up of immigrants without a 4-year degree.
In textile manufacturing, that's 29% of the workforce is immigrants without a 4-year degree.
Yep. 27% is in food manufacturing specifically.
27% is also in hotel and accommodation industry.
And then 24% is both for construction and 24% in administrative and support services. So you see that there's a large portion of these industries, specifically of migrant workers who are working without a 4-year degree. It's pretty impactful.
Yeah. And working in those specific types of jobs in sort of the labor market.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I found some kind of cool information about immigration in science specifically. And what I mean by that is people who are immigrants who participate in science. 40% of American-based Nobel Prize winners are immigrants.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
That's almost half as far as I know.
Right? Yeah.
That's how I understand math. 49% of postdocs are immigrants as well.
Yeah, that one really surprised me too. Like that is half.
That's
almost
huge. That is half. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is half of like people. They say that what is it like 2% of people obtain their doctorate worldwide, something like that.
Yeah, I think it's about that.
It's something that low, and then more than about half of them are immigrants. And as far as that goes,
29% of science and engineering faculty are immigrants.
Wow. And so when you think about these numbers, it's important to know that anti-immigration rhetoric might actually be driving folks that are highly talented and high contribution scholars to immigrate to other countries. So the United States, because we are so piss poor about how we talk about immigration, we end up probably losing people who would be valuable contributors to our local communities and to our fields of science that would be innovators in these fields that are doing really important work.
Yeah. Exactly. Some of the major breakthroughs that could be happening here are happening elsewhere because people don't feel welcome to come to this country. The people who are very, very intelligent, very innovative, who have great ideas, who want to come here and develop their ideas into a very lucrative industry and are basically turned away. And then they go somewhere else and they turn it into a lucrative industry.
Absolutely.
It's kind of interesting to look at for the United States where immigrants are coming from. Interestingly, Asian immigrants are the fastest growing group of people who are migrating to the United States.
So Africa and folks from other parts of the Americas are generally a growing group. So we're seeing a lot of people enter the U.S. from places like Mexico, Canada, from South America. So that's kind of consistently growing.
And Central America as well, yeah.
And Central America, yes.
The groups that are shrinking include European and then some of the Northern American immigrants, I think from Canada specifically.
Yeah.
Those groups of people tend to be a shrinking group of people immigrating to the United States.
Do you blame them? That's like watching your neighbor like blow up their house every other day and then be like, "Hey, can I rent a room from you?" No, thanks. I'm going to go ahead and probably move down the street.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Or in another block or part of the city entirely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when the cops come, we don't know them.
Yeah, I think that's all the fun statistics we have about this. So some major take-home points here. One, I think, is that to try and cover both of these, there's a lot going on with immigration. But the thing I think that's the most important take-home is that if governments, local and federal, create a path to legal immigration that makes it as seamless a transition as possible, everybody wins. Everybody wins. Mm-hmm. Because even doing so, like there might be an impact to some of those small labor market segments, but it's relatively minimal, and it's further minimized by having that path to legal immigration. Because another thing that happens is that people are like, well, they're flooding these regions. I'm like, well, then help move them to places where people are actively trying to grow their community. Like they often end up where they end up out of sheer necessity. And so it's like people probably want other opportunities. I mean, I personally am not trying to live in a super hot deserty southern place. I say that while looking out my window at like 7 inches of snow. But
Right.
but I like where I live, and I think other people do too. So there are lots of opportunities, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think another take-home point I would have here is that with immigration being such a major talking point, like many times the arguments are just racist dog whistles. Like they're not based on any sort of fact or any sort of truth. Like immigration is a good thing, and we need more immigration in general. Like it brings diversity, it improves the economy, it does all the things that people want, like for their communities. So like it's mind-blowing that, you know, people are making these arguments. People are making these arguments, like at least people who are educated on this, like that understand, that are not just like following mouthpieces. People know that these are racist dog whistles. They're just going out and saying, we don't want people who look different than us in our countries. And that's a bummer. But then people who are watching Fox News who don't know how to discriminate that information are going, well, we're going to lose our jobs. And there might be some small pockets of people that has been the case, but it's unfortunate because overall the net benefit of immigration is it's net benefit. It's not net loss.
Yeah.
It's benefiting everybody involved.
I think if you are pro-capitalism, you should probably be pro-immigration. If you're pro-growing the economic success and freedom of the United States, you're going to be pro-immigration. If you are pro having a powerful country with a strong government that is very competitive against other governments, you're going to be pro-immigration. I think if you like people, you're going to be pro-immigration. If you are huge on freedom and liberty, you're going to be pro-immigration. Like,
right.
Like all of these, it's actually funny because I feel like from a purely economic financial standpoint, I would expect conservative policies to be very pro-immigration. They're not because of racism and almost nothing else. Like,
right.
All of it is fear-mongering and racism because every other thing aligns with the values espoused by that position.
100%.
Yeah. And so like, it's kind of surprising to me that that's where things are at, you know? And so I don't know. I've said, I was like, you know what? Send them to my city. I'm like, I would be really happy to have this major influx of immigrants coming here. And like, you know, we'll try and build houses as fast as we can and stuff, but we do have like 1 billion apartments, so we're probably good on that end.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I would be very open to it.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it just it's one of those things where I wish more people would take the time to really understand like what goes into this and what is involved in just maybe this is the last take home point I would look at is just realizing that immigration involves people.
Yes.
People moving either towards something or away from something, right? That's all it is. Those push and pull things. And so when we go back and we think about people being people and humanity being humans and just being kind to one another, like it doesn't make any sense that we would make somebody's life harder because we dislike a certain thing about like maybe where they're coming from or what. It doesn't make any sense to me. So I guess the main thing is be a human being and think about this and support immigration.
And I'll go and end with, I agree with that. And I think that's a fantastic point, but I'll end with immigration does come with a cost. It comes with a cost to the people who are immigrating. It comes with a cost to the country from which they're immigrating. And it does come with a cost to the country that is receiving the immigration. However, receiving immigrants is a net gain. And again, I'm going to quote Pia Orenius, I think I'm saying that right, from the George W. Bush Institute, where she said, quote, immigration has net benefits. The fact that it has some costs is not a reason to bar it, but rather to manage it, end quote. I think that's a beautiful way of exactly articulating kind of the points we've been trying to make along this whole thing.
Yeah.
All right, we're running a little bit long, but let's get to some recommendations.
Recommendations.
Okay, I am recommending a movie that is, at this point, very old, but it's been on my radar to watch for a long time. I finally got around to it. It is the movie Moneyball, largely starring Brad Pitt, Jonah Hill, and Philip Seymour Hoffman, and quite a few other people. But yeah, I generally do not like sports movies. Not like on principle. I just tend to not be super interested in them.
Yeah.
And also like dry stories about people who are trying to like make money.
Yeah.
Is like, and just like do so through statistics is not usually a huge grabber for me. But this movie was really well done. Everything about it. Like I was intrigued. I was invested the whole time. I wanted to see where the story was going and what happens next. The delivery was just very well done. So if you're interested in watching it, I recommend it. Go check out Moneyball.
I've heard it's really, really great. So I'm glad you got to check it out.
I heard it's also based on a book that's supposed to be really good, and I might go read that now because the movie was so good.
Okay. I like that. Well, speaking of books, I read a book, and it's the last book I read for 2022, and I thought it was pretty apt with everything going on.
Sure.
And that is a book called 1984. I'd read this as a kid. It's a popular read. It's one of the banned books. It's on those lists. You know, it's got all kinds of stuff going on. A lot of torture in it.
This is George Orwell, right?
George Orwell. George Orwell. I think it gets written off as like, because when we read it in like middle school, I read it in middle school.
Okay.
And then I read it again in high school. And so like, I think it gets written off as like a book for kids, and it's really not.
No.
No, it is not. It is not. Yeah, people forget there's like a whole prostitution scene. There's torture. There's a lot of torture in this. And there's like a whole like rebellion manifesto written into this book. There's a lot of stuff in it. What I'm recommending here is rereading these books that you read as a kid that you thought were kind of boring maybe, or like maybe you didn't really get, and rereading them as an adult with a different view, because I think that you'd be pleasantly surprised by how poignant and impactful and really powerful some of these books are. I mean, like I'm like at the stage now where I'm like, I don't want to read Catcher in the Rye again, because from what I understand, Holden Caulfield's kind of a snotty baby. But I like, Catch 22. I'm thinking like books like The Things They Carried and stuff like that I read when I was a kid. I'm like, we should probably go back and read those and see how they are now.
Sure. Yeah, I get that. Yeah, I've been wanting to reread like Of Mice and Men and some of those.
Yeah.
And I never read The Handmaid's Tale. So yeah, I've got some on my list that I agree. And I tend to love classic literature.
Yeah.
And I remember liking 1984, although it's an extremely depressing book that just...
It's bleak.
Yeah. Bleak is a grim, bleak book. That's a very good way to describe it.
Yeah. And real quick, I just want to be clear. It's also not a handbook for politics. So like people should stop using it as that.
Yes, very much so. Or to like say that it actually represents anything that's happening in the like it was a good meditation on like where politics could go awry. I think that's fun, but nobody's actually trying to do it. So there's that.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. If you'd like to tell us about a book that you read at the end of 2022 or a movie that you watched recently that you have been putting off for 12 years, you should do that and reach out to us. If you would like to comment about anything that we've said about immigration, particularly if you have some awesome agreements that you'd like to share, we're really happy to hear those. But if you have constructive criticism, I'm open to hearing it. I realize that we came at this from a biased position, and I also tried to come at this from a very science evidence-based position. I really did try and find a wide variety of sources, and they pretty much all agreed. Where they disagreed was largely on like what should be legal or illegal immigration. And that I think is a question that we tried to tackle to some extent in this.
Sure.
I'm really happy to continue this conversation. Feel free to reach out to us and tell us your thoughts on anything that we discussed in this or the other immigration episode.
Absolutely.
If you like what you heard today and you like to support the show, then you can always leave us a rating and review, tell a friend, subscribe, pick up some merch from a merch store. We've got all kinds of stuff there.
Yeah.
Things that look really cool when you have them. And it says like the name of a podcast. And people are like, you listen to podcasts? I listen to podcasts. Let's talk. And then it's a great icebreaker. Is that the thing?
I agree.
You can also join us on Patreon. And when you do that, you get to watch videos of us pontificate and sometimes just read articles, apparently.
Yeah, as we did today.
Or discuss wild things. You get access to the behind the scenes note and contents. You get early releases of our episodes and ad-free content and all kinds of fun stuff like that. And you can join for as little as $1 a month or as much as you would like to throw our way. And speaking of people who have made that leap, and we just appreciate them oh so much, that includes Amanda, Brad, the Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kelly, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. Thank you all so much for your continued amazing, awesome support.
Yes.
Thank you very much to my team, which includes Justin, Alan, Jess, Patrick, and Shane. Thank you for recording with me today.
Always.
And of course, thank you, listeners, for being here with us and joining us on this ride and this journey through all these things. Hopefully you aren't fuming and shooting steam out of your ears because you're like, those damn liberals. Although we generally would both probably describe ourselves that way, I really do try to come at these episodes from a just purely as scientific as I can be, understanding that I have bias, and I try and be data-driven and evidence-based. But my bias will shine through. Okay, that is, I think, all that I have. Anything that I'm missing that you can think of?
I got nothing else.
All right, then that is it. This is Abraham.
This is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.